Post-memory to me sounds so much like a therapy term. It's funny because I was just reading an article the other day about how millennials are the therapy generation, that we value it and we prioritize it more than other generations before us. And it's just interesting, while we were going through this unit, I just kept thinking about different buzzwords and phrases that I've seen on things like social media, or I've shared with my friends about things like, rejecting toxic people and toxicity in your life, and breaking generational cycles and inherited trauma, and these things that we now just speak about so regularly. But post memory ties so well into that, like this idea of having your own set of memories that have been transmitted to you from somebody else's experience and somebody who raised you, is such an interesting concept that I just feel like it just sounds like something that people would use in conversation. But as it was discussed in the readings that we did, I think that it's interesting looking at the different perspectives of post memory, such as things like proximity or shared events and culture and things like that. Like, for instance, in Mouse, how Art is raised by his father, who is a Holocaust survivor, and how he has this such close, deep personal connection with the Holocaust as a result of his father being a survivor, and that the traumatic incidents, the traumatic events that happened during his father's life, and just the fact that his father and his mother surviving these events, and the effect that had on their lives, and therefore had on their son's life, is just interesting. Like, for instance, the fact that um, Art's mother killed herself. She dies by suicide and has an issue coping, and considering that she already had a battle with mental health before the Holocaust, and that it traveled through with her throughout her life, definitely speaks a lot to inherited trauma, because in and of itself, losing your mother, especially by suicide, is also traumatic in its own right. But I do also think that the idea of having your parent survive something like the Holocaust is such an interesting idea, because you do think about the type of relationship that you'll have with your father or your mother, considering the fact that what they went through in order for you to even exist, definitely is something that definitely could cause strain and tension in your relationship, because in some ways it's very difficult to understand each other. Um, I also think that thinking about post memory and inherited trauma, not necessarily as a result of like national events or a world event, but even thinking about it in the sense of like just your culture, or the culture that, you know, the culture where your parents originate, and even within different events that happened within your family. So in No Name Woman, the events described where the protagonist's aunt kills herself, as a result of living in this culture in China that, shuns women who have children out of wedlock, and don't even bother to hear their side of the story. And even going through the main character's journey of trying to make sense of that, and trying to understand the culture that where her parents come from, how that culture fits into her life in the United States, and even making sense of exactly what the story was that shaped her aunt, that drove her aunt to do what she did, so much so that it drives her to create the story. I also think that Sherman Alexi's Fixed Income, Honor Society, and Valediction are very interesting, because not only are the main characters within those stories inheriting trauma and understand their parents and grandparents coming from this background of poverty and lack of resources, they also themselves are living within that time. In Fixed Income and Honor Society, the main characters speak directly about being poor and trying to figure out a way to make a better life for themselves, trying to earn enough money, like at a minimum wage job, to be able to go to college, or even collecting cans and illegally driving to the next town over to be able to make money to be able to take the SATs. That this is an example of post memory, but at the same time, though, living within that memory. But what makes it post is that the protagonists have the perspective of figuring out exactly how to make it out of it, and then also being able to look at their parents and grandparents as examples of what could happen. So, and then I think that another interesting perspective on post memory is in Juno Diaz's Island Born. Lola is a little girl, so she definitely is having her first encounter with this idea of the monster. And I think many people can identify with this idea of there being a first time you learn about something. Even as a little kid, the first time you learn about this traumatic thing that happened to your family and it having a very, very significant, you having a very significant reaction to these events and to these things that you get that got passed down to you. I think the way the three units that we covered in the last couple of weeks fit together, they fit together in a way sometimes that they tell a very whole and complete story. They have a beginning, middle, and end, and not necessarily in the sense that all three of these things are chronological, like where it's like, oh, first you have the American dream, then you have this idea of nostalgia, then you have post memory, because these things can exist on the same timeline and on completely different timelines for different individuals, or for even the same individual. But I do think of the idea of maybe the American dream just being this thing where it's a dream. It's this idea in someone's head that isn't quite yet tangible, and even when they start to realize the dream isn't necessarily tangible, they do still go on living. So that second generations that are in America, they essentially are, in some cases, their parents' American dream. That, being able to make a family and like a life for yourself and have your children be American citizens is part of that. But then you have these second generation immigrants who are experiencing these feelings of, lack of connection to their home, to their ancestral homes, so much so that they feel like they have to either go back there or they have to make connections. And they try and make sense of their walk in America that's been influenced by their parents who come from somewhere else, but also by what exactly they've experienced in the United States by being American, but also being from somewhere else. And then I think post memory fits into the idea of the future, in the sense that you have to have a little bit of distance in order to have post memory. That you have to be able to look back. You have to be able to look back or have a little bit of difference or a different perspective on what happened to past generations in order to be able to form your own memories of those things happening, and then also be able to try and kind of make sense and figure out exactly what that means.